The screen is filled with the sound of typewriter keys and the low hum of fluorescent lights. A grainy black and white image appears. The federal building in downtown Chicago, mid-1960s. Men in dark suits cluster on the sidewalk, hats pulled low against the wind off Lake Michigan. A heavy-set figure steps out of a government car, his shoulders hunched, his overcoat collar turned up. Flashbulbs pop. Reporters shout his name, asking about allegations of racketeering, of hidden fortunes of the Chicago outfit. He keeps walking. No glance to the cameras. No comment. Just a brief tightening of the jaw as he moves toward the courthouse doors. The caption under the newsreel image reads, "Samuel Battaglia." To law enforcement, he is a suspected boss of Chicago's organized crime syndicate, a bridge between the rough street gangs of Prohibition and the more structured, low-profile criminal empires of the post-war era. To the press, he's another symbol of a city struggling to shake its reputation for corruption and clandestine power. And to those who grew up in his West Side neighborhood, he is a familiar name in a long chain of tough men who emerged from the tenements and back alleys that ringed the downtown loop. Behind that brief walk up the courthouse steps lies half a century of American urban history, immigration and poverty, discrimination and opportunity, the rise of gangland power in the shadow of Prohibition, and the gradual transformation of Loose Street crews into a disciplined underworld organization. Samuel Battaglia did not create that world, but he rose within it, one of a generation of boys who saw the city's unofficial economy as their only realistic path upward. To understand how he became one of the most feared and closely watched figures in Chicago's underworld, we have to leave the courthouse behind and return to the crowded streets of an earlier time. The year is 1908. Chicago is a city of steam and soot, its skyline climbing higher with each new steel-framed building. On the near west side, not far from the stockyards' stench and the clang of the rail yards, clusters of Italian immigrants have carved out their own enclaves. They crowd into narrow brick tenements, sharing space with families who have only recently left the old country, bringing with them their language, their food, their saints' days, and their fears. In this world, Samuel Battaglia is born on February 7, 1908, the child of Italian immigrants trying to find their footing in an often hostile city. Precise details of the Battaglia family's early domestic life are sparse in the public record, but the broader contours of their world are well documented. Italian immigrants in early 20th century, Chicago often lived in overcrowded housing, took whatever work they could find, on construction crews, in factories, as laborers, street vendors, or small shopkeepers, and met with suspicion or outright hostility from parts of the broader society. Newspapers of the era routinely portrayed Italian neighborhoods as dangerous and alien. Signs reading, "No Italians need apply," were not uncommon. The young Samuel grew up in an environment where money was tight, prejudice was familiar, and official avenues of advancement, through education or business, were difficult to access. On the streets around him, the lines between law-abiding survival and petty crime could be thin. Children worked early, running errands, shining shoes, hawking newspapers. Some graduated from those hustles to more serious forms of theft and smuggling, especially as they watched older boys earn quick cash by less legitimate means. In these neighborhoods, the local saloon or social club could be as important as the church or the school, and the men who held real authority were sometimes not elected officials, but toughs with reputations, men who could fix a problem, settle a dispute, or make someone disappear from a debt ledger. Chicago in these years was also a city of reformers and social workers. Just a short walk from Italian neighborhoods stood settlement houses like Hull House, founded by Jane Addams, where immigrants could study English, learn trades, and seek help navigating the new society around them. But reaching those resources took time, energy, and a willingness to interact with official institutions that many immigrants distrusted. For boys like Samuel, The pull of the street could be stronger than the promise of assimilation. By the time he reached his teens, Chicago was bracing for seismic change. In 1919, the United States ratified the 18th Amendment, ushering in national prohibition. The manufacture and sale of alcohol were to be outlawed. On paper, it was a moral crusade. In practice, it created a vast black market. In cities like Chicago, where saloon culture and social drinking were integral parts of many communities, the demand for alcohol did not vanish. Instead, it moved underground, and with it came new opportunities and new forms of organized criminal power. For a boy growing up on the near West Side, the effects of these changes were visible in daily life. Speakeasies replaced corner bars. Delivery trucks that had once carried legitimate goods now quietly moved illegal alcohol. Men who had previously scraped by suddenly flashed better suits, nicer cars, and thicker rolls of cash. Many of these men were connected, directly or indirectly, to the emerging bootlegging empires that would soon make Chicago infamous. While there is no evidence that the teenage Battaglia was a major player in these early Prohibition years, the atmosphere around him was saturated with stories of fast money and respect won by those willing to operate outside the law. Police and court records indicate that by the early 1920s, Samuel's name had begun to appear in official files. Like many young men of his neighborhood and generation, he gravitated toward street gangs, loosely organized groups of adolescent and young adult males from the same immigrant districts. These gangs engaged in petty theft, car stealing, and occasional more serious offenses, and they supplied manpower for older, more established underworld figures looking for fearless young recruits. Later law enforcement summaries describe Battaglia as an early member of the so-called 42 Gang, a West Side teenage crew that attracted a remarkable roster of future outfit figures. The 42 Gang, its name likely borrowed from a popular comic strip reference at the time, was notorious among Chicago police in the 1920s. Its members were young, bold, and willing to take risks. They engaged in car thefts, hijackings, and small-time robberies, often acting as freelancers for established crime bosses. Among their number were future luminaries of the Chicago outfit, including Sam Giancana, Marshall Cafano, and others who would later control major rackets in the city. Battaglia's association with this group placed him in a network that supplied the next generation of leadership for organized crime in Chicago. The transition from adolescent mischief to more serious criminal conduct was gradual but clear. Arrest reports from these years, as summarized in later investigative files, suggest that by his late teens and early 20s, Battaglia had been picked up multiple times by police for offenses ranging from theft to more serious allegations. Not every arrest led to a conviction. In the chaotic legal environment of Prohibition-era Chicago, witnesses were hesitant to cooperate, evidence often went missing, and overloaded courts struggled to keep up with the volume of cases. But the pattern was enough to mark him, in official eyes, as a young man on a troubling trajectory. Chicago's broader criminal landscape during these formative years revolved heavily around Prohibition. Alphonse Al Capone, who took over the South Side mob in the mid-1920s, became the public face of Chicago crime, a flamboyant, media-savvy figure whose exploits made national headlines. But beneath the Capone mythos was a more complex reality. The city's underworld was divided into various factions, with alliances and rivalries running along ethnic, territorial, and economic lines. Italian, Irish, and Jewish gangs jostled for control of bootlegging routes, gambling dens, and protection rackets. Violence was commonplace, but its depiction in later mythologizing often obscures the more mundane daily work of administering illicit businesses. Young gang members like those in the 42 Gang functioned as foot soldiers and apprentices in this environment. They learned who controlled which neighborhoods, what lines not to cross without permission, and how to navigate both real danger and the ever-present threat of police attention. They also observed how the upper tiers of organized crime insulated themselves, using layers of intermediaries and legitimate fronts to keep distance between themselves and the street-level violence and risk. It was in this world that Samuel Battaglia's reputation began to solidify. Physically imposing, he stood out in police line-ups and on the streets alike. Later accounts from law enforcement officials and journalists describe him as a man of few wasted words, whose temper could flare quickly. The nickname Teats, which would follow him for the rest of his life, reportedly grew out of a characteristic mispronunciation. According to one often repeated story, he once threatened an associate, vowing to bust you in the teeth, and the distorted word stuck among his peers. However accurate the precise origin, the nickname captured something of how contemporaries perceived him, a tough, blunt instrument in a world where reputation could mean survival. The 1920s were also years in which the distinction between political power and underworld power in Chicago was often blurry. Municipal corruption was a persistent problem. Reformers lamented that ward bosses and precinct captains were sometimes too willing to trade favors with local toughs in exchange for votes or payments. In neighborhoods like the one where Battaglia grew up, the machine politics of City Hall intersected with the informal authority of gang leaders. For ordinary residents, this meant that the person who could get a streetlight fixed, arrange for a relative's job, or make a minor court case disappear might just as easily be a local gangster as an elected official. For young men navigating this environment, the underworld could appear less as a purely criminal sphere and more as an alternative power structure woven into everyday life. Contemporary sociological studies of Chicago's Italian districts noted that some residents saw gang figures as both a threat and a resource, capable of violence, but also occasionally providing aid, credit, or protection when official institutions failed them. This ambiguity did not excuse criminality, but it helps explain how individuals like Battaglia could rise to prominence. They offered services, enforced their own version of order, and exploited the gaps in a rapidly growing city's ability to manage all its neighborhoods fairly and effectively. As prohibition dragged on, the stakes grew higher. The profits from illegal liquor were enormous, but so were the risks. Law enforcement pressure increased, especially from federal agencies. Competition between gangs led to highly publicized outbreaks of violence that shocked the nation. The infamous St. Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929, in which 7 men were gunned down in a North Side garage, became a symbol of Chicago's lawlessness, even as most citizens would never personally witness such extremity. While there is no evidence that the young Battaglia played any role in that episode, the event and others like it signaled to him and his contemporaries that Chicago's underworld was not a playground. It was a dangerous, high-stakes arena. The end of Prohibition in 1933 forced another transformation. With the legal sale of alcohol restored, one of the most lucrative criminal markets dried up almost overnight. For Chicago's criminal organizations, this was not an ending but an opportunity to diversify. They expanded their involvement in illegal gambling, labor racketeering, loan sharking, and the infiltration of legitimate businesses. A generation of men who had been hardened by the bootlegging years now sought new revenue streams. For mid-level figures like Battaglia, no longer an adolescent but not yet at the top of the hierarchy, this period offered chances to prove themselves in different roles. Available records from the 1930s and early 1940s place Battaglia increasingly in the orbit of what would become known as the Chicago Outfit, the more formalized successor to the loose bootlegging gangs of the 1920s. By this time, direct day-to-day control rested less with flamboyant public figures like Capone, who had been sidelined by tax evasion charges, and more with quieter, strategically minded leaders who prized discretion. They valued associates who could generate income, enforce discipline, and keep themselves out of the headlines. Battaglia's combination of toughness, loyalty to his circle, and familiarity with West Side neighborhoods made him a valuable asset. Law enforcement documents from later decades often looked back on this period as the time when Battaglia and his 42 gang contemporaries were effectively absorbed into the outfit's structure. They were no longer just street thieves. They were part of a network that reached from neighborhood taverns to union halls, from gambling dens to the back rooms of seemingly respectable businesses. In this world, violence was a tool, not a goal in itself, used to enforce agreements, intimidate rivals, and keep subordinates in line. At the same time, leaders in the outfit understood that too much visible brutality invited unwanted attention from both the press and the authorities. The preferred strategy was to operate in the shadows, letting rumors of reputation do much of the work. For the communities in which Battaglia operated, this shift had mixed consequences. On one hand, the overt gang wars of the earlier Prohibition years grew less common on busy streets. On the other, the outfit's reach into legitimate economic and social institutions deepened. Illegal gambling, unregulated lending, and corruption in labor unions could undermine the stability of households and neighborhoods in more subtle but far-reaching ways. People who fell behind on unregulated loans, or who challenged corrupt practices in workplaces, might find themselves facing powerful, well-connected enemies, among them men like Battaglia. By the start of the 1940s, Samuel Battaglia had traveled a long way from the crowded immigrant apartment of his youth. His early encounters with the law, his involvement with the 42 gang, and his gradual integration into the outfit had set him on a path that would eventually bring him to the attention of federal investigators and congressional committees. Yet at this stage, he was still largely a local figure, known primarily to police, fellow gang members, and residents of the neighborhoods where he operated. The national press had not yet fixed its gaze on him. Public attention was increasingly consumed by the unfolding global conflict of the Second World War. Behind the headlines of that global war, the structures of Chicago's underworld continued to evolve, positioning men like Battaglia for greater influence in the post-war era. The foundations of his later reputation, as an enforcer, an organizer, and eventually a figure identified by authorities as a leading member of the outfit, had been laid in these early decades. They emerged from a specific combination of personal choices and historical circumstances. Immigration and poverty, discrimination and opportunity, the sudden wealth of Prohibition, and the recalibration that followed its repeal. The boy born in 1908 into a marginal, stigmatized neighborhood had found a kind of status in a parallel world, one that stood outside the law but deeply affected the lives of those around it. The choices he made in those formative years would shape not only his own fate, but also the story of organized crime in Chicago for decades to come, eventually leading back to that stark moment on the courthouse steps, under the gaze of cameras and the scrutiny of a nation increasingly determined to understand and confront the hidden powers that had grown up in its cities. By the early 1940s, the boy from the near West Side had grown into a solidly built man in his 30s, moving through a city that was again being reshaped by national events. The Second World War had turned Chicago into one of the great industrial arsenals of the United States. Factories that once made consumer goods now produced weapons, aircraft parts, and machinery for the war effort. Freight trains rolled out of vast rail yards day and night, moving materials to coastal ports. The city's working-class neighborhoods pulsed with overtime shifts and new arrivals looking for wartime jobs. Within this atmosphere of patriotic mobilization, another, quieter economy continued to function. Wartime rationing of gasoline, meat, sugar, and other staples created temptations for black markets. Stolen ration books, diverted supplies, and favored access to scarce goods could all be turned into profit. For an organization like the Chicago outfit, already practiced at supplying illegal alcohol during Prohibition, shifting into these new opportunities was less a transformation than an adjustment. And for men like Samuel Battaglia, who had spent the 1920s and 1930s proving their toughness and reliability on the street, the war years offered a chance to deepen their importance inside the outfit's networks. The surviving record does not place Battaglia at the center of any single famous wartime racket. Unlike some contemporaries, he never became a publicly recognized figure in Union politics or citywide scandals during these years. Instead, the available evidence suggests a pattern of steady advancement, his name appearing more often in police intelligence files, his associations with other known outfit members becoming more firmly established, his role in collecting debts and enforcing informal rules on the West Side growing more pronounced. For Chicago law enforcement, he was no longer just another alumnus of the 42 gang. He was an operative for a maturing criminal syndicate. The upper tiers of that syndicate were undergoing their own upheaval. In 1943, federal prosecutors brought a major case against several top outfit leaders, accusing them of extorting money from the Hollywood film industry through control of labor unions. The so-called Hollywood extortion case resulted in convictions for figures like Paul the Waiter, Ricca, and Louis Little New York Campagna. Frank Nitti, long a key leader in the outfit, died by suicide rather than face trial. These blows did not destroy the organization, but they did accelerate a generational shift. In the power vacuum that followed, Anthony "Tony" Accardo, already a respected figure within the outfit, emerged as a central strategist. He, in turn, depended increasingly on a cadre of younger men who had cut their teeth in the 42 gang and similar street crews. Among them were Sam Giancana, Marshall Cafano, Fior Buccieri, and Samuel Battaglia. The system was not formal in the way of a government hierarchy. Titles like boss or caporgime were rarely written down. But in the confidential memoranda of the Chicago Police Department and the FBI, patterns took shape. Under Accardo's quiet guidance, these younger men were seen as key lieutenants responsible for specific territories and kinds of activity. All the while, the public face of Chicago's war effort projected order and unity. The newspapers ran photos of enlistment drives and war bond rallies. Italian Americans, once heavily stigmatized, were now more easily understood as patriotic citizens as thousands of their young men donned U.S. uniforms and shipped out. Yet in the neighborhoods that had produced the 42 gang, certain old realities persisted. Poverty did not disappear. Discrimination did not evaporate. And the dependence of some small businesses on protection from local toughs, or on unregulated credit when banks would not lend, remained a fact of life. It was in these circumstances that Battaglia's reputation as an enforcer and collector seems to have hardened. Later FBI summaries, drawing on informants and local police, describe him as physically intimidating and personally involved in the collection of debts connected to illegal gambling and high-interest loans. These accounts emphasize his willingness to use the threat of force to ensure repayment, while also noting that actual confrontations were often brief and calculated. The goal was not spectacle, it was compliance. People in debt to outfit connected lenders knew that refusal or delay could have serious consequences, even if those consequences were rarely splashed across newspapers. Loan sharking, as the practice came to be known, operated in a space that many working-class Chicagoans understood too well. Banks often refused to extend credit to those without established collateral or strong connections. Emergency expenses, a medical bill, a repair, a period of unemployment, could push families to seek money wherever they could find it. Outfit-backed lenders were ready with cash, but their terms were punishing. Interest could be charged weekly, sometimes at rates that made full repayment extremely difficult. A borrower might manage for a time by paying only the interest, never touching the principal, effectively locking themselves into a permanent dependence. It was in the enforcement of these arrangements that men like Battaglia played a crucial role. The end of the Second World War brought another wave of change. Millions of veterans returned home, including many from Chicago's Italian neighborhoods. The federal GI Bill offered educational and housing benefits that opened new avenues into the middle class. Some families moved to newly built suburbs, others invested in small businesses, but not everyone benefited equally. Patterns of segregation and discrimination persisted in housing and employment. For those left behind in aging urban districts, the presence of the outfit was still an everyday reality. Chicago's underworld leadership, now firmly under Ricardo's influence, was adapting as well. With prohibition long past, the outfit's main sources of income included illegal gambling, especially off-track horse betting and numbers games, labor racketeering, and the very loan sharking operations in which Battaglia is known to have played a significant part. There was also growing interest in legitimate businesses that could serve as both fronts for illicit activity and sources of real profit: restaurants, trucking companies, construction firms, and more. The city's political apparatus, for its part, continued to wrestle with corruption. Reformers periodically won elections on promises to clean up machine politics and break the influence of hoodlums, as they were commonly called in official reports. Yet the practical realities of governing a vast metropolis often pulled in the other direction. Ward organizations needed money and manpower. Some precinct captains maintained quiet understandings with local outfit figures, trading non-interference for assurances that outright mayhem would be kept to a minimum. For the average resident, the result could feel less like a war between authorities and criminals, and more like a complex, unspoken arrangement among powerful interests. It was within this web of relationships that Battaglia, by the late 1940s, appears to have solidified his status as a recognized outfit figure on the West Side. Intelligence bulletins labeled him a hoodlum and a strong-arm man long before his name appeared in major indictments. He was reported to frequent certain taverns and social clubs that served as informal offices for bookmakers, loan sharks, and other underworld operatives. His association with Sam Giancana became a recurring theme in internal law enforcement communications. The two had grown up in the same loose network of gangs and now operated as part of the same criminal regime. Despite this accumulating file of suspicion, securing convictions against men like Battaglia remained extremely difficult. Witnesses were understandably reluctant to testify, particularly in cases of extortion or illegal loans, where the very admission of having participated could expose them to legal or reputational harm. Jurors, drawn from a city where stories of intimidation were common, could be uneasy about rendering verdicts against well-known enforcers. And some judges and police officers, corrupted by payments or political pressure, simply did not pursue such cases aggressively. This combination of fear, reluctance, and corruption created an environment in which notoriety did not necessarily translate into courtroom accountability. On the national stage, concerns about organized crime were mounting. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, a series of high-profile investigations began to piece together evidence that criminal groups were cooperating across city and state lines. In 1950, the U.S. Senate created the Special Committee to investigate crime in interstate commerce, chaired by Senator S. Kefauver of Tennessee. Over the next 2 years, the Kefauver Committee held televised hearings in cities across the country, including Chicago, calling witnesses ranging from small-time bookmakers to reputed national crime figures. Chicago's underworld, schooled by years of hostile publicity surrounding Al Capone, chose a strategy of resistance. Many key figures simply refused to testify, invoking their constitutional rights against self-incrimination. Others declined to appear at all, forcing the committee to rely on second-hand accounts from police, journalists, and local officials. In this environment, the detailed inner workings of the outfit did not fully emerge into public view, but its existence and influence were once again thrust before a national audience. Samuel Battaglia did not become a household name during the Kefauver era in the way that some other figures did. His role at that time, while significant to Chicago law enforcement, was still several steps removed from the top layer of nationally recognized leadership. But the committee's investigations had indirect effects that would shape his future. The hearings convinced many in the federal government, including a previously skeptical J. Edgar Hoover, that organized crime was indeed a serious national problem requiring sustained attention. In response, the FBI began what became known internally as the Top Hoodlum Program, instructing each field office to identify and monitor the most influential criminal figures in its jurisdiction. In Chicago, field agents compiled lists that included the familiar names Accardo, Ricca, Giancana, and also men like Battaglia who were seen as enforcers and potential successors within the outfit's hierarchy. Surveillance increased. Informants were cultivated. Financial records were scrutinized more closely. For someone like Battaglia, who had spent decades operating in a milieu where local influence and personal intimidation were his main defenses, this new level of federal attention represented a shifting landscape. The post-war years also saw the outfit extending its reach westward, particularly into the rapidly growing gambling scene of Las Vegas. Chicago money flowed into casinos, sometimes through hidden ownership stakes, sometimes through influence over labor unions that could help shape the operations and profitability of those establishments. While there is no clear evidence that Battaglia personally oversaw casino interests, the environment in which he worked was increasingly interconnected with this broader, interstate network. Profits from gambling in Nevada and other jurisdictions could flow back to Chicago, supporting loan sharking and other local operations in which he played a part. Back in the city's neighborhoods, the social fabric was changing again. Urban renewal projects displaced long-standing communities, including Italian and other ethnic enclaves near the central business district. Expressway construction cut through old streets and residential blocks, altering patterns of daily life. Some families moved further out, others clustered in remaining districts. For the outfit, these changes required adaptation. The physical spaces that had once provided natural bases of operation, tight-knit, walkable neighborhoods where everyone knew each other, were being fragmented. Men like Battaglia adjusted by maintaining networks that were less dependent on a single street corner and more on long-standing personal ties. As he entered his 40s and early 50s, Battaglia's public profile remained muted compared to flamboyant figures of an earlier era. He did not seek cameras or cultivate a larger-than-life media persona. Photographs from police files show a heavyset man with a serious expression, often in plain suits rather than ostentatious attire. This low-key demeanor was in keeping with the outfit's broader strategic shift away from the kind of publicity that had brought down Al Capone. The preferred image was that of invisible influence. Decisions made in back rooms, money moved through seemingly legitimate channels, disputes settled quietly before they became public scandals. Yet for those who lived in areas under his influence, Battaglia's presence could be felt in more direct ways. A tavern owner refusing to install certain gambling machines might receive a visit from one of his associates. A small business owner falling behind on a high-interest loan might find the terms of negotiation very limited. Even those who had no direct dealings with him or his crew often understood the social geography of power, which bars to avoid after certain hours, which topics not to discuss too loudly, which names not to bring up casually in the wrong company. The official record from this period shows periodic arrests and questioning, but few lasting legal consequences. As before, witnesses were scarce, and charges often failed to stick. Nevertheless, each arrest added another entry to the growing dossier that federal and local authorities were assembling. By the early 1950s, analysts within these agencies routinely described Battaglia as an important enforcer and emerging leader within the Chicago outfit's West Side operations. As the decade progressed, the internal balance of power within the outfit began to tilt once more. Tony Accardo, wary of the increasing scrutiny that came with being seen as the absolute head of the organization, took deliberate steps to move further into the background. He continued to exert enormous influence, but day-to-day operations and public risk were gradually shifted to a new generation of lieutenants. Among them, Sam Giancana would become the most well-known, eventually being identified by many observers as the outfit's front-line boss. In this reshuffling, Battaglia's standing rose further. His long record of service, his reputation for toughness, and his close ties to Giancana and other key figures positioned him as more than just an enforcer. In law enforcement terminology, he was now often described as a high-ranking member of the outfit. The precise contours of his authority, how many men reported to him, what rackets he controlled directly, remained partly obscured by the secrecy that surrounded such matters. But the general trajectory is clear. From a young street thug in a West Side gang, he had become one of the inner circle of a powerful, deeply rooted criminal organization. The city around him was changing, but certain patterns endured. Money still flowed from illegal gambling, unregulated credit, and the exploitation of vulnerable individuals and institutions. Fear and silence still protected those at the top from many of the consequences of their actions. Yet the forces gathering against them, federal investigators, reform-minded prosecutors, and an increasingly assertive press, were growing stronger. For Samuel Battaglia, the years ahead would bring a new level of confrontation with those forces, pulling him from the relative shadows of neighborhood intimidation toward the full glare of federal courtrooms and national scrutiny. Those years of confrontation began quietly enough. In outward appearance, the mid-1950s seemed, for many Chicagoans, like a calmer, more prosperous time. The war was over, the city's factories were humming, and a growing middle class was moving into new suburban subdivisions advertised as havens of safety and respectability. Television sets glowed in living rooms. Children walked to newly built schools. On the surface, Chicago's old image as a wide-open gangster town appeared to be fading into the past with the sepia photographs of Al Capone. Beneath that surface, however, the mechanisms of the outfit had not disappeared. They had simply become less obvious. Anthony Accardo and his close associate Paul Ricca stayed as far from cameras as possible, guiding policy from quiet homes in the suburbs and private rooms in city restaurants. Below them, a layer of operational leaders, including Sam Giancana and the circle of former 42 gang members around him, managed day-to-day rackets. Samuel Battaglia, now in his late 40s, was firmly within that circle, recognized by police and FBI agents as a key player in the outfit's West Side and loan sharking operations. By this time, his official record had become extensive. Internal police compilations, later summarized in federal files, listed arrests and investigations stretching back 3 decades, early street crimes as a teenager, more serious charges as a young man, and repeated contacts with law enforcement through the 1940s and early 1950s. Not all of these episodes resulted in convictions, but the cumulative picture was of a man deeply embedded in the city's shadow economy. To detectives who had spent their careers following such figures, Battaglia was no mystery. The difficulty lay not in identifying him, but in finding a way to bring evidence that could stand up in court. As suburban Chicago expanded west and north, the neighborhoods closer to downtown where Battaglia and his associates operated were undergoing a different transformation. Some long-standing Italian, Jewish, and other ethnic communities faced pressure from urban renewal projects and the construction of new expressways. At the same time, African-American families moving north from the Jim Crow South during the Great Migration settled in large numbers on the south and west sides, often in overcrowded and under-resourced districts. Economic tensions and racial anxieties rose. In this environment, illicit credit, gambling, and protection schemes found a continuing market. Loan sharking remained one of the outfit's most dependable sources of profit, and it was an area in which federal and local investigators repeatedly placed Battaglia. People shut out of conventional credit because of low incomes, discrimination, or simple lack of collateral, often turned to informal lenders. These lenders, backed by outfit muscle, could provide cash quickly but on terms that soon became crushing. Interest was charged weekly or monthly at rates far beyond anything a bank would offer, and missed payments could bring not only further penalties, but the risk of direct intimidation. Accounts collected by law enforcement from informants and victims describe a familiar sequence. A borrower in difficulty, whether a small contractor, a tavern owner, or a wage earner facing an emergency, took a loan from a source connected, openly or quietly, to the outfit. For a time, payments were manageable. But if business turned down, if an illness struck, if any of the countless ordinary misfortunes of working-class life intervened, keeping up with the schedule became much harder. When that happened, men like Battaglia or those acting on his behalf appeared to insist on compliance. Sometimes a stiffly worded reminder was enough. Sometimes the pressure escalated. The exact methods varied, the message did not. The harm such practices caused was not as dramatic as the headlines of gangland murders, but it was no less real. Families sank under the weight of unpayable debts. Small businesses that might have survived a temporary setback collapsed under the additional burden of predatory interest. Fear and humiliation silenced many victims. They hesitated to go to the police, worried that they would be dismissed, blamed, or left to face the consequences alone. This climate of intimidation and stigma was part of what allowed the outfit systems to function as long as they did. On the law enforcement side, the 1950s brought new tools and renewed determination. The FBI Top Hoodlum program was in full effect. In Chicago, agents prepared detailed background reports on each man they considered a leading figure in the outfit. Battaglia's file thickened with surveillance notes, photographs, and cross-references to other investigations. The Chicago Crime Commission, a privately funded watchdog group, published lists of so-called public enemies and leading racketeers. Battaglia's name appeared on these rosters, an indication that, at least among those following organized crime closely, he was no longer a secondary figure but a recognized power. The federal government's broader interest in organized crime was also intensifying. After the Kefauver hearings had introduced the topic to millions of television viewers, further inquiries followed. On the East Coast, the 1957 raid on a gathering of mob figures in Appalachian, New York, revealed a level of intercity coordination that many officials had previously denied or minimized. Although Chicago's top leadership carefully avoided obvious exposure at such events, federal investigators now felt more confident arguing that there existed a national network of criminal organizations, of which the Chicago outfit was a central component. This shift in understanding had consequences for men like Battaglia. Where earlier investigations might have seen him primarily as a local extortionist or neighborhood tough, the new perspective framed him as part of an enterprise that affected interstate commerce, positioned him as a potential target for federal statutes originally designed to combat labor racketeering and commercial extortion. It also meant that his movements and communications were more likely to be monitored, his financial activities more closely examined for patterns that might suggest hidden ownership or profit sharing in apparently legitimate ventures. Inside the outfit, these same years saw another gradual realignment of authority. Accardo and Ricca, still powerful, continued to prefer a low profile. In the mid-1950s, they encouraged Sam Giancana to assume a more visible leadership role, dealing with outside interests, managing disputes among subordinates, and serving, whether he wanted to or not, as a lightning rod for law enforcement attention. Giancana, dynamic and ambitious, brought a different style to the top job. He cultivated contacts in the world of politics and entertainment, projected a certain swagger, and did not always adhere to the older generation's preference for absolute discretion. For Battaglia, already a long-standing ally of Gincana from their 42 gang days, this transition likely meant a closer alignment with the nerve center of outfit decisions. Federal summaries from the late 1950s and early 1960s often mention him in the same breath as Gincana, Cafano, and other trusted lieutenants. He was reported to be involved in discussions over the division of territory for loan sharking and gambling operations, and was frequently observed in the company of known bookmakers and collectors. When Gincana's name surfaced in national news stories linking organized crime to labor unions, Las Vegas, and even rumored attempts to influence foreign politics, federal officials increasingly viewed Battaglia as part of the same inner circle. This did not mean that he suddenly abandoned his established base on the west side. On the contrary, one of the outfit's strengths lay in maintaining strong local anchors even as it pursued more geographically wide-ranging opportunities. While some associates focused on casino investments and union contracts far from Chicago, figures like Battaglia ensured that the cash flow from traditional urban rackets, neighborhood gambling, street-level loan sharking, local protection schemes continued without interruption. Those steady streams of income helped support more speculative ventures and provided a cushion against national enforcement campaigns that might disrupt one or another branch of the enterprise. In the public mind, the 1950s and early 1960s were also the era when the romanticized image of the gangster took on new forms in movies and television. Old newsreel footage of Tommy gun-wielding Prohibition-era mobsters was recycled for entertainment, while fictionalized portrayals of organized crime blended elements of fact and exaggeration. For individuals living in neighborhoods under outfit influence, however, there was little glamour in the day-to-day reality of dealing with bookmakers, collectors, and loan officers tied to men like Battaglia. Behind closed doors, arguments over unpaid debts, lost wagers, or disputed protection payments could lead to threats, broken business relationships, and broken trust within families. Public officials in Chicago often walked a fine line in how they addressed this reality. On the one hand, mayors and police superintendents periodically announced crackdowns, raiding gambling spots, making sweeping arrests, and promising reform. On the other, long experience had taught outfit leaders that these periods of intense publicity were often followed by quieter stretches in which operations could resume in a somewhat more cautious fashion. For the most part, Battaglia seemed to survive these waves of enforcement relatively intact, his operations adjusting tactically but remaining structurally sound. The election of John F. Kennedy in 1960 ushered in a federal administration whose attitude toward organized crime was more aggressively adversarial. Robert F. Kennedy, first as Senate counsel in investigations of labor racketeering, and then as Attorney General, made combating the syndicates a central priority. He publicly named Chicago as one of the crucial hubs of national organized crime and specifically called out its leadership by name. While the Attorney General tended to focus on the most publicly prominent figure, Gincana, his Justice Department also targeted the broader network of which Gincana was a part. In congressional hearings and press conferences, Kennedy and his allies described loan sharking and related forms of extortion as among the most insidious of the syndicate's activities. They emphasized how such practices drained resources from honest businesses, distorted labor relations, and corrupted local institutions. These descriptions, though focused on policy arguments rather than individual biographies, spoke directly to the kind of work for which Battaglia had long been known to law enforcement. For investigators in Chicago, the new national climate translated into more resources, more backing from Washington, and a clearer mandate to pursue complex cases. The techniques of investigation were also changing. Advances in electronic surveillance, covert microphones, and telephone taps installed under warrant or sometimes before legal standards were fully clarified, gave federal agents unprecedented glimpses into the conversations of suspected mob figures. In Chicago, several notable social clubs and hangouts frequented by outfit leaders were eventually bugged. While not every recorded conversation produced usable evidence, the cumulative effect was to map the relational landscape of the organization in greater detail than ever before. In some of these monitored environments, the name Teats surfaced repeatedly. Agents listening and heard about collections to be made, disputes to be settled, percentages to be passed up the chain. The very fact that he was discussed in such contexts confirmed his status in the outfit's upper tier. Although prosecutors would still need independent corroboration to build a case directly against him, the recordings helped frame investigative priorities, indicating where to focus surveillance of movements, financial transactions, and contacts with potential victims. Local prosecutors, too, were sharpening their strategies. Rather than treating each alleged act of intimidation or extortion as an isolated incident, they increasingly tried to show patterns that could support more serious charges under federal statutes like the Hobbs Act, which criminalized the obstruction of commerce through extortion, and later, racketeering-related laws that allowed prosecutors to argue that individuals were part of an ongoing criminal enterprise. Even before the landmark racketeering statute RICO would be enacted at the end of the decade, these tools allowed more complex, multi-defendant cases. For someone in Battaglia's position, this shift meant that what might once have been handled as a local case with uncertain prospects, one borrower's complaint, one bookmaker's story, could now be woven together with other accounts, bank records, and surveillance reports into an indictment alleging an organized scheme. The margin of safety that had long protected figures like him from serious legal consequences was narrowing. The first cracks in that protective shell became visible as the early 1960s progressed. While precise dates and case names can bury a narrative in detail, the broad outline is clear from contemporary press reports and court records. Federal prosecutors began to move aggressively against Chicago loan sharking operations. Undercover informants were cultivated who could describe not only their own experiences, but the broader structure of the lending networks. Some victims, perhaps emboldened by the new national rhetoric against organized crime, perhaps simply unable to continue under the weight of debt, agreed to testify. As these efforts gathered steam, Battaglia's name started appearing not just in background briefings and internal memos, but in the text of sealed indictments and draft complaints. Prosecutors alleged that he was not merely an enforcer, but a key organizer of a system that used threats and implied violence to collect unlawful debts from business owners and individuals. They argued that this system affected interstate commerce by draining money from legitimate enterprises, influencing which suppliers they could pay, which expansions they could fund, and ultimately whether they survived at all. The process of building such a case was slow and methodical. Grand juries heard hours of testimony. Agents cross-checked stories against bank deposits, telephone records, and the movements of suspects tracked by surveillance teams. Defense attorneys, aware of growing federal interest, counseled their clients to be cautious in their conversations and to maintain layers of intermediaries wherever possible. Within the outfit, there were likely anxious discussions about how far to go in pressing reluctant debtors at a time when any complaint could bring a team of agents to their door. Despite these precautions, momentum was moving in one direction. By the mid-1960s, the federal government was ready to act. Indictments were handed down naming multiple Chicago figures, including Samuel Battaglia, in connection with extortion and unlawful debt collection schemes. The charges framed their behavior not as isolated street crimes, but as part of a broader pattern of organized racketeering. For Battaglia personally, it was the most serious legal challenge he had yet faced. A confrontation not with a single police precinct or short-term task force, but with the full weight of a federal Justice Department determined to set an example. For Chicagoans who had known of him only as a name murmured in taverns or whispered in loan offices, the transformation into a public defendant was abrupt. Newspaper stories began to profile him, drawing on police photographs and old arrest records. Journalists reached back into the city's Prohibition era, past to trace the line from the 42 gang to the modern outfit. Federal officials, while careful not to comment on the specifics of a pending case, spoke in broader terms about breaking the back of loan sharking and sending a message that no figure, however feared in the neighborhoods, was beyond the reach of the law. The man who had spent decades cultivating an aura of silent threat now found himself compelled, in a sense, to speak, through lawyers, through motions, through his physical presence in the federal courthouse. The measured anonymity of his earlier years could not hold against subpoenas, arraignments, and the steady interest of the press. As he walked again up the steps of the same building glimpsed in that opening newsreel frame, flanked this time not by fellow outfit associates, but by federal marshals and defense counsel, the long arc from Immigrant Street Kid to nationally watched defendant came sharply into focus. For Samuel Battaglia, the years of quiet accumulation of influence, of fear, of unpaid moral and legal debts, had finally tipped into a new phase. The next chapter in his story would be written not in the back rooms of West Side clubs, but in the formal language of indictments, testimony, and verdicts, under the bright lights of a justice system that had, at last, decided to take him on directly. When the federal indictments finally moved from rumor to reality, they did so with the blunt formality of legal documents and the quiet choreography of marshals and clerks. In mid-1960s Chicago, as national attention was pulled between the civil rights movement and the war in Vietnam, a different kind of campaign was taking shape in offices lined with case files and statute books. For the Justice Department prosecutors who had spent years tracking the Chicago outfit, the name Samuel Battaglia appeared not as a bit player, but as one of the central figures in a case they hoped would demonstrate that the federal government was now serious about dismantling entrenched rackets. The charges that emerged against him reflected this broader strategy. They did not center on a single brawl or an isolated act of street violence. Instead, prosecutors alleged that Battaglia and several associates had participated in an organized, ongoing system of extortion built around unlawful credit. Federal statutes designed to protect commerce, most prominently the Hobbs Act, which criminalized extortion affecting interstate business, provided the legal framework. The government's theory was straightforward. By using threats to collect inflated debts and force payments, the defendants had distorted the normal flow of economic life, injuring not only individual borrowers but the broader marketplace. When Battaglia was first summoned to answer these accusations, the scene in the federal courthouse carried echoes of earlier eras of Chicago crime drama, but with important differences. He arrived not as a brash young gunman riding the wave of prohibition headlines, but as a heavyset man in his late 50s, his dark hair thinning, his face set in an expression of studied calm. Reporters, now carrying tape recorders as well as notepads, watched him closely as he was led into the courtroom. Some of them knew his name from internal crime commission lists and police briefings. Others were more familiar with the better publicized figures of the outfit, and were only now turning their attention to this comparatively quiet enforcer. The formal reading of the indictment laid out the prosecution's case in dry, legalistic language. It alleged that over a period of years, Battaglia had conspired with others to extend credit on unlawful terms and to collect on those debts by means of intimidation and threats. It described how business owners in Chicago, unable to secure conventional bank loans, had turned to underground lenders connected to the outfit, and how, when payments fell into arrears, men like Battaglia appeared, or had others appear on their behalf, to insist that the money be paid, regardless of the borrower's circumstances. To the public sitting in the gallery, such language might have sounded abstract. But for the prosecutors, each clause in the indictment represented a person who had come forward, a set of bank records obtained by subpoena, a conversation overheard during surveillance, or a line in an undercover agent's notebook. Building the case had required persuading frightened debtors to tell their stories, corroborating those stories with documentary evidence, and convincing a grand jury that the pattern they described was not a series of isolated, unfortunate incidents, but the work of a coordinated criminal enterprise. Battaglia, through his attorneys, entered a plea of not guilty. From the defense table, his strategy appeared aimed at two interconnected goals: to cast doubt on the credibility of government witnesses and to challenge the framing of the alleged acts as organized extortion rather than, at most, private disputes over money. His lawyers suggested that some of the borrowers had histories of gambling or unreliable business practices, and that they might be exaggerating or misrepresenting events to shift blame for their own financial failures. They also argued that the government was overreaching, attempting to transform what should have been local matters into federal crimes in order to serve a political narrative about a war on organized crime. The trial that followed unfolded over days and then weeks, an accumulation of detail rather than a single dramatic revelation. The courtroom heard from small business owners who described taking cash from lenders introduced to them in taverns, back rooms, or through word of mouth when banks turned them away. They recounted the relief of receiving the money and the mounting anxiety as the schedule of payments outpaced their ability to keep up. Some spoke hesitantly about visits from men they understood to be collectors, who reminded them of their obligations in ways that left no doubt about the seriousness of failure. The prosecutors did not seek to shock the jury with graphic stories. They didn't need to. Their aim was to demonstrate consistency. Different witnesses from different neighborhoods and trades told stories that echoed one another. Similar interest rates, similar repayment terms, similar phrases used during collecting visits, and repeatedly the same handful of names surfacing when asked who controlled the network behind the loans. Among those names, according to their testimony, was Battaglia. On cross-examination, defense attorneys pressed hard. They asked whether the witnesses had reported threats immediately to the police or only after being approached by federal agents. They highlighted any previous brushes with the law, any unpaid taxes, any signs that might suggest a motive to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for leniency. They questioned the exact words used in alleged threats, seeking to blur the line between a stern reminder of a debt and a criminal act of extortion. Above all, they tried to sow doubt about whether the witnesses could truly connect their experiences to the man seated at the defense table, rather than to unnamed intermediaries. The atmosphere in the courtroom oscillated between tense and methodical. There were no dramatic outbursts from Battaglia. Observers noted that he sat mostly impassive, occasionally leaning over to confer quietly with his lawyers, his eyes fixed on the witnesses as they spoke. If the testimony stung, it did not show on his face. For a man whose reputation had been built in part on an aura of self-contained menace, there was perhaps a strategic calculation in presenting himself before the jury as controlled, almost subdued. Outside the courtroom, however, the public framing of the case was less restrained. Newspapers described the trial as a major test of the government's campaign against Chicago's shadow rulers. Editorials praised the courage of borrowers who had agreed to testify, presenting them as ordinary citizens standing up to a system that had long seemed untouchable. Commentators pointed out that, unlike the spectacular gangland killings of an earlier era, the practices at issue here harmed people quietly, through financial pressure and fear that often never reached the front page. In that sense, they argued, A successful prosecution would be as significant a blow against organized crime as any previous headline-grabbing victory. Within the outfit, the proceedings were watched with a very different concern. Battaglia was not just another collector. He was, in law enforcement eyes at least, one of the men closest to the center of power. His conviction, should it come, would not only remove a key operative from the field but also risk exposing methods and relationships the organization preferred to keep in the dark. There were limits to what could be done. The era when witnesses could simply be made to vanish without drawing overwhelming attention had faded. The federal government's resolve and capacity were stronger, the public more alert to such tactics. But discreet pressure, subtle reminders to potential witnesses about the dangers of speaking too freely, could still be applied. Even so, a number of borrowers remained willing to testify. Some did so under protection. Others, perhaps, felt they had little left to lose. Their stories, dryly transcribed in court records, collectively painted a picture of a system that exploited desperation. They described how amounts borrowed to keep a business afloat or to handle a personal emergency doubled or tripled under the weight of compounding interest and penalties. They spoke of nights spent awake worrying not just about money, but about the safety of themselves and their families if they failed to pay. The damage, as they recounted it, was not just economic but psychological. When the prosecution rested its case, the defense faced the difficult decision of whether to put Battaglia himself on the stand. Doing so would have allowed him to directly deny involvement and to present himself to the jury as something other than the shadowy figure sketched in law enforcement memos and whispered neighborhood stories. But it also would have exposed him to cross-examination by prosecutors well-versed in his long history of contacts with police and his associations with known offenders. In the end, he did not testify. His lawyers relied on their cross-examinations of government witnesses and on arguments about burden of proof, urging the jury to resist what they framed as a politically motivated push to make an example of their client. The closing arguments crystallized the conflicting narratives. The government framed Battaglia as a seasoned member of an organized criminal syndicate, someone who had spent decades profiting from the fear of others, and who had now, finally, been brought within reach of justice. They emphasized that the law did not require victims to be perfect citizens to deserve protection. Even if some borrowers had gambled or made poor business decisions, that did not give anyone the right to terrorize them in pursuit of debt. The defense, in turn, urged the jury to see reasonable doubt everywhere, in inconsistent recollections, in the supposed motives of cooperating witnesses, and in the government's reliance on inferences about the structure of an alleged conspiracy. Jury deliberations stretched over hours and then into another day. For Battaglia, waiting in a holding room, the long line from his youth in a crowded immigrant neighborhood to this moment in a federal courthouse must have seemed both improbably winding and in some ways inevitable. He had spent a lifetime navigating around laws and lawmen, betting on silence, intimidation, and the difficulty of proving what everyone knew but few would say. Now, 12 strangers held the power to decide whether that calculus would hold. When the jury returned, the courtroom filled quickly. The foreman stood, the clerk asked the formal questions, and the answers came in a flat, unadorned tone. Guilty on counts related to conspiracy and extortion in the course of unlawful debt collection. For the first time in his adult life, Samuel Battaglia faced not just the inconvenience of an arrest or the uncertainty of a dismissed charge, but the reality of a substantial federal conviction. The sentencing hearing that followed a short time later underscored the government's view of his significance. Prosecutors argued for a severe penalty, stressing not only the specific counts on which he had been convicted, but his long record of prior arrests and his alleged leadership role in a broader criminal enterprise. They described the damage loan sharking inflicted on communities, portraying him as a central enforcer of that damage. His attorneys, pointing to his age, family ties, and the non-violent nature of the specific charges, urged the court to show restraint. The judge, bound by statutory limits, but also influenced by the prevailing national determination to confront organized crime, imposed a substantial prison term. Contemporary news accounts reported a sentence in the range of the maximum allowed for the offenses, signaling to both the public and the outfit that the court took its role in this larger struggle seriously. A significant fine accompanied the prison term, intended to undercut any perception that such crimes were merely a cost of doing business for well-funded racketeers. When marshals led Battaglia from the courtroom after sentencing, it marked more than a personal turning point. For law enforcement, it was the culmination of years of investigation and a symbol of a new era in which long-entrenched figures could be brought down through careful, patient legal work rather than sensational raids alone. For the outfit, it was a reminder that even those who had survived decades of policing could not take their immunity for granted. For the neighborhoods where he had once been a visible presence, it raised complex feelings. Some quietly welcomed the news. Others wondered who would step into the vacuum and what that would mean for them. Convictions in federal court are not the end of a legal story, and Battaglia's case was no exception. His attorneys promptly filed notices of appeal, arguing before the U.S. Court of Appeals that errors in the admission of evidence, in the judge's instructions to the jury, or in the structure of the indictment itself had deprived him of a fair trial. Appellate judges, looking not at the human drama but at the technical record, reviewed transcripts, motions, and precedents to determine whether any reversible mistakes had been made. The published appellate opinion, when it came, upheld the conviction. The court found that the government had presented sufficient evidence to support the jury's findings, that the relevant statutes had been properly applied, and that the trial judge had not overstepped in his rulings. In the language of the law, it was a measured, tightly reasoned document. In practical terms, it meant that Battaglia would serve the substantial sentence imposed on him, with only limited possibilities for modification through later motions or parole. Behind prison walls, the world that had shaped him continued to evolve. The late 1960s and early 1970s were years of profound change in American cities. Chicago itself was shaken by large-scale civil unrest, political turmoil, and intense public debates over policing, poverty, and justice. The outfit, though still powerful, faced increasing pressure from new legal tools, including the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, passed in 1970, which gave prosecutors an even more effective way to target criminal enterprises as collective entities, rather than only as isolated individuals. From a cell in a federal penitentiary, Samuel Battaglia could no longer move freely through the taverns and back rooms of the West Side, could no longer make personal visits to debtors or preside over quiet meetings with other outfit men. Accounts from law enforcement and later organized crime researchers suggest that he retained some degree of influence, as many incarcerated leaders did, through visits, letters, and intermediaries. Decisions about loan sharking and related rackets still bore the imprint of the system he had helped shape. But the era in which he could apply his own presence as a direct instrument of pressure had ended. For a man who had spent most of his life operating in the spaces where official power and unofficial authority overlapped, the strict routines of federal imprisonment represented a stark reversal. Schedules were fixed by others. Movement was controlled. Privacy was minimal. The informal hierarchy of prison life was different from the intricate social architecture of Chicago's neighborhoods. Some fellow inmates knew him by reputation. Others saw just another older convict adapting, or struggling to adapt, to institutional life. Outside, journalists and criminologists began to reassess the history of Chicago's underworld with more distance. Stories of the 42 Gang and its alumni were told and retold, often with a mixture of fascination and moral unease. In these narratives, Battaglia appeared as a connective figure, less ostentatious than Capone, less notorious in national folklore than Gincana, but indispensable to understanding how the brutal energy of youth gangs had been channeled into the disciplined, profit-driven structures of the outfit. His conviction for loan sharking became a case study in how the quiet exercise of fear could be as damaging to civic life as the loudest shootouts of the Prohibition years. Yet for all the commentary, the core of his story remained grounded in the choices he had made and the structures that had enabled those choices. The boy who had grown up in an overcrowded immigrant district, who had seen limited legitimate avenues for advancement, had taken the path of the street gang and then the organized syndicate. He had risen by being useful to those above him, collecting, enforcing, organizing, until he himself became one of the men at the top. The same skills that had brought him power in that underworld, his physical presence, his reputation for resolve, his ability to inspire fear, had, in the changed legal and political climate of the 1960s, placed a target squarely on his back. By the time the iron gates closed behind him on his federal sentence, Samuel Battaglia's trajectory had traced the arc of an entire phase of American urban history. From the rough ethnic enclaves of the early 20th century through the wild years of Prohibition and the slow consolidation of organized crime into a quieter, more insidious force, and finally into an era when the law, armed with new tools and a broader mandate, was determined to push back. The remaining years of his life would unfold largely out of public view, but their shape and their meaning would be inseparable from the decades he had spent helping to build and ultimately being brought down by the world of the Chicago outfit. The clang of the courtroom door closing behind him marked a rare moment when Samuel Battaglia was no longer in control of his surroundings. For most of his adult life, he had operated in spaces where his presence dictated the mood of a room. In the federal system that now claimed him, the rhythms of his days were set by others' guards, wardens, regulations, and time itself. The man who had spent decades walking freely through West Side taverns and back rooms was processed into a federal penitentiary, photographed again, issued a number, and folded into a world of tiered cell blocks, scheduled counts, and institutional meals. He was no longer young. Pushing 60 at the time of his conviction, he entered prison at an age when many of his contemporaries were thinking of retirement, grandchildren, and slower days. Decades of stress, rich food, cigarettes, and the constant low-level tension that came with his line of work had left their marks. Law enforcement summaries from the period describe him as heavyset, with graying hair and a face that had lost the sharpness of youth. Prison medical staff, accustomed to evaluating new arrivals with an eye to long-term care, would have noted his age and condition as risk factors. Incarceration meant not just confinement, but a forced confrontation with the physical toll of his life. Inside, however, his name still carried weight. Federal prisons in the mid-1960s housed a mix of offenders, bank robbers, fraudsters, narcotics traffickers, and an increasing number of organized crime figures swept up in the Justice Department's expanding campaigns. Among those who followed crime news, the Chicago outfit had a reputation as one of the most disciplined and far-reaching syndicates in the country. Within that organization, Battaglia was known as a seasoned leader, a man directly linked to the all-but legendary West Side crews of earlier decades and to the current hierarchy built around Tony Accardo and Sam Gincana. Even behind bars, that reputation did not disappear. To prison administrators, inmates like Battaglia posed a particular kind of challenge. On the one hand, they were older, often better behaved day to day than younger, more volatile prisoners. They tended to avoid random fights and obvious rule-breaking, preferring a low profile. On the other, they sometimes sought to recreate within the walls the patterns of influence they had exercised outside, forming cliques, mediating disputes, and in some cases, attempting to maintain contact with their criminal networks on the street. The Bureau of Prisons and the FBI, increasingly coordinated, watched figures like Battaglia carefully for signs that they were directing ongoing activity from their cells. The means of communication available were limited but not non-existent. Letters were censored but not always perfectly. Visits could be monitored, though quiet conversations in visiting rooms sometimes slipped past full scrutiny. Defense attorneys, bound by confidentiality, provided another, legally protected channel, one that could be used for legitimate appellate work, but which law enforcement worried might sometimes be exploited for coded messages. It is difficult to reconstruct, in detail, the extent to which Battaglia attempted to exercise influence from prison. FBI memoranda from the period suggest concern that incarcerated outfit figures in general were still being treated as sources of authority by associates on the outside, but the precise content of any communications in his case remains largely behind classification or lost in time. What is clear is that his conviction and removal from Chicago were seen both by law enforcement and by later analysts as a blow to the outfit's West Side operations. For years, he had been one of the central figures overseeing loan sharking and related extortion rackets in that territory. His presence in neighborhoods, his personal reputation, and his role within the outfit's decision-making structure combined to give those operations coherence and discipline. His sudden absence created space that would be filled by younger or slightly less prominent men, and space that, for a time, offered law enforcement a chance to disrupt long-standing patterns. On Chicago streets, the late 1960s were turbulent even without the undercurrent of organized crime. The city became a focal point for national tensions, racial segregation and demands for civil rights, controversy over policing, debates about urban renewal, and in 1968, the explosive clashes surrounding the Democratic National Convention. In many working-class neighborhoods, the same economic insecurities that had once driven men to seek loans from underground lenders persisted or intensified. Factories relocated or automated. Inflation began to erode wages. Where legitimate credit remained difficult to obtain, the temptation to turn to informal sources, some benign, others decidedly not, remained. The outfit adapted to these conditions with its characteristic pragmatism. Men who had served under Battaglia moved up to take more responsibility. Others, from different neighborhoods and ethnic backgrounds, were drawn into enforcement roles. While federal indictments had removed some key players, the organizational model they embodied survived. High-interest loans extended to the desperate, backed by threats and the implied possibility of retaliation. From his cell, Battaglia could see, through occasional news articles and snippets of conversation from visitors, that the system he had helped shape was far from dismantled. At the same time, the legal landscape outside was shifting in ways that would have profound consequences for organized crime. In 1970, the U.S. Congress passed the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, giving prosecutors a powerful new tool. Under RICO, it was no longer necessary to treat every act of extortion, bribery, or illegal gambling as an isolated offense. Instead, the law allowed prosecutors to argue that such acts were part of a pattern of racketeering activity, conducted through an enterprise, precisely the sort of structure that defined the Chicago outfit. RICO also included forfeiture provisions, enabling the government to target not only individual offenders, but the assets of the organizations themselves. For men like Battaglia, already incarcerated under earlier statutes, RICO did not change their immediate legal status, but it did signal that the era in which their organizations could rely on fragmented law enforcement efforts was ending. Their remaining associates on the outside now had to contend with a federal framework that explicitly conceived of organized crime as an integrated system, rather than a series of local headaches. The kind of loan sharking and extortion for which Battaglia had been convicted would, going forward, be understood and prosecuted as part of a much broader pattern. Within the prison environment, age and health exerted their own pressure. By the early 1970s, Battaglia was in his mid-60s. Contemporary reports and later biographical sketches indicate that he suffered from heart-related ailments, not uncommon among older inmates with his background. The Bureau of Prisons, recognizing the need for specialized medical care, often transferred prisoners with serious conditions to facilities equipped for treatment. Federal medical centers where hospital wings existed alongside conventional cell blocks. There, inmates might receive tests, medications, and supervised therapies that standard penitentiaries could not provide. Reports from this period describe Battaglia as increasingly focused on his own physical decline, a stark contrast to the imposing figure who had once loomed so large in law enforcement bulletins. Whatever informal influence he retained over outfit affairs would have been limited by these realities. Younger relatives and associates stepped more fully into the roles of collectors and organizers. Old names faded from the active case files of FBI and Chicago police units, replaced by new ones. For a man whose adult identity had been tied so tightly to his status in the underworld, the combination of incarceration and waning health represented a profound contraction of the sphere in which he could meaningfully act. In Chicago, meanwhile, the outfit faced challenges on multiple fronts. The death of older leaders, the exile and later violent death of Sam Giancana, and sustained federal pressure on gambling and labor racketeering operations all forced adaptation. The organization did not disappear. It reshaped itself, with newer figures like Joseph Ayuppa and Jackie Cerrone rising to prominence. Yet the aura that had once surrounded Chicago's criminal syndicate, the sense that it loomed almost untouchably over the city's affairs, began to fray. Each successful prosecution, each conviction, chipped away at the perception of invincibility that had been one of the outfit's greatest informal assets. Battaglia's case contributed to that erosion in a particular way. Unlike prosecutions centered on spectacular acts of violence, his conviction highlighted the everyday, grinding harm of economic exploitation. It brought into public view the reality that organized crime's power rested not only on dramatic confrontations, but on thousands of smaller transactions in which ordinary people felt they had no safe or legal alternative. In congressional hearings and academic studies that followed, his case was cited as an example of how juice loans, as they were colloquially known, functioned on the ground, and how law enforcement could intervene effectively if given the tools and the will. It is tempting, in looking back on such figures, to seek dramatic moments of regret or transformation. The historical record for Battaglia's final years, however, offers little in the way of intimate self-revelation. Prison files and appellate documents tend to focus on procedural matters, medical updates, disciplinary reports, which, in his case, appear not to have been unusually severe, and routine correspondence about sentence calculations. If he reflected on the path that had led him from a crowded immigrant neighborhood to the top tiers of the outfit, and then to a prison infirmary, those reflections did not find their way into the public record. What we do know is that he did not regain his freedom. He died in federal custody in the early 1970s, in his mid-60s, from natural causes related to his declining health. Contemporary reports note the date and circumstances in brief paragraphs, typically framing his death in terms of its significance for the outfit. Another of the old 42 gang generation gone, another link to the rough formative years of Chicago's modern underworld severed. There were no grand funerals with press coverage akin to those of some earlier mob figures. The era of public gangster pageantry had largely passed, and prison regulations constrained what could be done. His passing marked, in a quiet way, the closure of a full circle. The boy born in early 20th century Chicago, at a time when Italian immigrants were still widely marginalized, and their neighborhoods dismissed as breeding grounds for trouble, had ridden the currents of that world to become a feared local power, and then a nationally watched defendant. He had helped translate the impulsive violence of youth gangs into a more systematized, economically driven form of criminality. And he had lived long enough to see that system come under sophisticated, sustained legal attack from a federal government that, for much of his early life, had seemed either indifferent or ineffective. In the years after his death, scholars, journalists, and law enforcement veterans sought to understand what figures like Battaglia meant for the broader story of American cities. Some emphasized the damage. The way loan sharking and extortion had drained capital from neighborhoods that could least afford it, the fear that had kept victims silent, the corrosive effect on trust in institutions when ordinary people saw criminals wielding more day-to-day power than courts or city halls. Others, without excusing his actions, pointed to the structural factors that had framed his choices: persistent poverty, discrimination in banking and employment, and a city political system that had sometimes tolerated or even quietly enlisted the muscle of men like him. What emerges from these assessments is not a romantic figure, but a deeply embedded one, a person whose life cannot be separated from the history of his environment. The Chicago into which Samuel Battaglia was born had, in some respects, primed certain paths for boys like him. Street gangs as avenues to status, informal economies as substitutes for excluded labor markets, skepticism toward authorities that seemed distant or hostile. That many others from similar backgrounds chose different routes into legitimate business, public service, or ordinary working class stability underscores that his trajectory was not predetermined. But it was also not simply a matter of individual will, divorced from context. For law enforcement, his story offered both cautionary and instructive lessons. It showed how long a determined, well-connected criminal could operate with relative impunity if witnesses were too afraid or ashamed to come forward, if local institutions were compromised, and if higher-level authorities lacked the conceptual and legal tools to see and attack the underlying system. At the same time, his eventual conviction and removal from the field illustrated that change was possible when those conditions shifted, when victims were protected and supported, when public opinion refused to trivialize or glamorize organized crime, and when the law organized itself around the reality of criminal enterprises rather than the myth of isolated, bad apples. In the corridors of the federal penitentiary where he spent his last years, none of that analysis would have been visible. To guards and fellow inmates, he was an aging prisoner with a long sentence, a man whose nickname hinted at a once formidable street presence now dulled by time and confinement. Outside, on the streets where his name had once evoked a mixture of fear and grudging respect, new problems and new figures claimed the city's attention. The storefronts and taverns that had served as his informal offices changed hands, were demolished, or slowly faded. Younger residents growing up amid different struggles might have known the name Teats only as a fragment from older relatives, conversations, if at all. Yet for those who study the patterns of power and resistance in 20th century Chicago, his life remains a crucial thread. It connects the era of open bootlegging and gang wars to the quieter, but equally damaging systems of economic coercion that followed. It demonstrates how organized crime, once it shed the showy violence that had drawn so much public outrage, could survive for decades by embedding itself in the intimate financial decisions of small businesses and families. And it shows that even the most entrenched of such figures could, under the right conditions, be confronted, tried, and held to account, imperfectly, incompletely, but in ways that altered the landscape of the city he had helped to shape. By the time the notice of his death was filed, and his name finally marked, closed, in active law enforcement case files, the Chicago outfit was already moving into a new phase, confronting fresh legal tools and social changes that would further diminish the kind of overt neighborhood domination he had once personified. The story of Samuel Battaglia, from his beginnings in a marginalized immigrant family to his end in a federal institution, thus stands not only as the biography of a single man, but as a window into the evolution of crime, law, and community in one of America's great cities. Decades after Samuel Battaglia died in federal custody, his name still appears in the dull light of archival reading rooms. Boxes stamped with FBI file numbers and Justice Department case codes hold memos, surveillance summaries, and trial transcripts that trace his movements across Chicago from the 1920s through the 1960s. The handwriting of agents has faded. The carbons of old teletype messages are brittle. Yet pieced together, they offer a composite portrait, not just of one man, but of the system in which he moved, and of the government's gradual effort to understand and confront it. In those documents, Battaglia rarely appears as a solitary figure. He is almost always embedded in networks, mentioned alongside Sam Giancana, Marshall Cafano, Fior Fifi Bucciari, and other alumni of the 42 gang, listed in tables of principal subjects in Chicago's so-called Top Hoodlum program, cross-referenced with license plates, telephone numbers, and the addresses of social clubs on the near and west sides. For investigators, the goal was never simply to know who he was. It was to map who he mattered to, who deferred to him, who feared him, and who might be persuaded to testify about him. These files also reveal how long it took the federal government to move from vague concern to concrete action. In the 1940s and 1950s, agents wrote memoranda noting his presence at certain taverns, reporting that informants identified him as a collector or enforcer within the outfit. They described him as armed, dangerous, and guarded by a local reputation that made witnesses reluctant to speak openly. For years, however, those notes sat in bulging folders, useful for understanding the terrain, but insufficient on their own to anchor a prosecution. It was only in the early 1960s, when federal priorities, legal tools, and local cooperation converged, that the information they contained could be turned into the kind of case that eventually sent him to prison. If the files show a man enmeshed in a web of relationships, they also place him within a cohort whose story helps explain the trajectory of organized crime in mid-century Chicago. Battaglia and his contemporaries were among the generation that came of age just after Prohibition's most turbulent years. As teenagers in the 1920s, they saw older gangsters achieve sudden wealth and notoriety. As young men in the 1930s and 1940s, they watched that first wave of flamboyant bosses imprisoned, deported, or marginalized, while a quieter, more disciplined leadership under figures like Paul Ricca and Tony Accardo consolidated power. Many of those who rose with Battaglia shared similar backgrounds: working-class Italian families in crowded tenements, limited formal schooling, early brushes with police over street-level offenses. The 42 gang became, in effect, an informal training ground. Its members learned how to steal cars, hijack trucks, and crucially, how to follow orders from older men who promised protection and advancement. Over time, that loose youth gang was absorbed into the outfit's structure. Some of its members became hitmen, others developed into organizers and financial managers. Battaglia landed in the latter category, though enforcement, using his physical presence and reputation to ensure compliance, remained central to his role. Sociologists and historians looking back on this period have emphasized that such trajectories were not simply the product of individual choices. They unfolded within specific urban conditions. The Italian neighborhoods of early 20th century Chicago were shaped by discrimination in employment and housing, by uneven access to education, and by a pervasive sense that official institutions were not designed for, or responsive to, their needs. Informal networks of mutual aid and protection filled some of the gaps, but they also created spaces in which criminal organizations could embed themselves, presenting their own services, credit, dispute resolution, security, as alternatives to distant or distrusted authorities. Battaglia's rise within the outfit's loan sharking operations can be understood in that light. On one level, the business was brutally simple: lend money at high interest, use intimidation to ensure repayment, and pass a share of the profits up the chain. On another, it exploited systemic inequities. The borrowers who ended up in court years later describing their dealings with outfit lenders were often people whom mainstream financial institutions had excluded. Small shopkeepers with no collateral, contractors operating on thin margins, wage earners with irregular income. For them, the choice was not between a fair loan and an exploitative one. It was between no loan at all and money offered on punishing terms. Within that framework, Battaglia functioned as a kind of unofficial bank manager for a shadow financial system. Federal agents noted meetings where he approved or denied requests for credit, often funneled through intermediaries. Collectors reported back to him on delinquent accounts. He was, in law enforcement parlance, a controller, someone who did not always appear in day-to-day street interactions, but whose word carried decisive weight in determining how hard to push a debtor, whether to extend more time, or when to escalate pressure. The cost of that system, borne mostly by those at the bottom of the economic ladder, was one of the key themes prosecutors emphasized when they finally put him on trial. By then, the political wind had shifted. The Kennedy administration's public focus on organized crime had raised the political value of such prosecutions. The FBI's growing pool of informants had improved the quality of evidence, and judges were increasingly receptive to the argument that patterns of extortion around credit did, in fact, affect interstate commerce in ways that justified federal intervention. Battaglia's conviction, therefore, occupies a pivotal place in the narrative of how U.S. law enforcement adapted to the reality of entrenched criminal organizations. Earlier cases against Chicago mob figures had often focused on tax evasion or on narrow labor racketeering schemes. By framing his activities as part of a broader pattern of extortionate lending, prosecutors signaled an evolving understanding that the heart of organized crime power lay in control over illicit markets and in the capacity to enforce contracts outside the law, not only in headline-grabbing acts of violence. From the outfit's perspective, his imprisonment and subsequent death in custody in 1973 marked the loss of one of the last key links to the old 42 gang generation. Others from that cohort had met different ends, some murdered, some dying quietly of natural causes after years of semi-retirement, some serving their own federal sentences. Taken together, their departures forced a generational handover. Men who had come up under them, often less steeped in the rough and tumble street violence of the 1920s, more oriented toward white-collar schemes and infiltration of legitimate industries, assumed greater control. Loan sharking did not disappear with Battaglia's removal, but its administration became less anchored to a single feared neighborhood figure. Control over credit rackets splintered among various outfit factions, and in some areas, newer criminal groups, including those rooted in different ethnic communities, began to fill the demand for informal loans. The symbolic power of a name like Tietz, which had once been enough to focus a debtor's fear, carried less weight as time and distance dulled its immediacy. At the same time, the very visibility of his case influenced how subsequent operations were structured. Knowing how prosecutors had built the indictment, through overlapping victim testimonies, paper trails, and surveillance, criminal organizations adjusted. They used more intermediaries, diversified the forms of collateral they demanded, and sometimes shifted toward schemes that left lighter documentary footprints. Law enforcement, in turn, used the lessons of the Battaglia prosecution to refine their strategies, seeking earlier intervention and broader application of conspiracy statutes to capture not only front-line collectors, but the decision-makers behind them. His death behind bars also underscored a generational shift in public attitudes toward figures like him. When Al Capone died in 1947, The event made national news. His funeral drew large crowds, and his story continued to feed an industry of myth-making. By contrast, the passing of Samuel Battaglia, while noted in the crime pages and in law enforcement circles, attracted relatively little public attention. Part of that difference reflects the changing media environment. Part of it reflects the outfit's own deliberate retreat from the theatrical violence that had made Capone so notorious. But it also suggests a quiet recalibration in how the public understood organized crime, less as a source of lurid fascination, more as a grinding, corrosive presence that bled communities of money and trust. For historians, this shift has important implications. It means that to understand figures like Battaglia, one must look beyond sensational episodes and into the more prosaic records of everyday harm. Court transcripts of debtors describing their fear, bank ledgers showing unexplained withdrawals, police intelligence notes on the steady passage of cash through certain taverns and storefronts. His life becomes a lens for examining the mechanics of power in mid-century Chicago. How informal authority was built on a reputation for toughness, how that authority translated into economic control, and how it intersected with official structures of politics and policing. Chicago's political machine, especially under Mayor Richard J. Daley, forms a crucial part of that context. While there is no evidence that Battaglia personally sat at the same tables as top city officials, the ecosystem in which he operated was shaped by a broader pattern of tolerated vice and negotiated order. Certain precincts were understood, informally, to be dominated by outfit interests. Certain businesses functioned as acknowledged, if unofficial, outposts of the underworld. In exchange for keeping overt violence low and support flowing to favored candidates, outfit figures could expect a degree of space to run their operations. It was into these gray zones, neither fully legal nor wholly outside civic life, that men like Battaglia moved with relative ease. That dynamic complicated law enforcement efforts. Local police officers, many of whom lived in the same neighborhoods, were often caught between personal familiarity, political pressure, and professional duty. Some cooperated quietly with federal investigations. Others turned a blind eye or actively tipped off outfit figures about impending raids. For federal agents assigned to track someone like Battaglia, sorting allies from obstacles among local institutions became a critical, time-consuming part of the job. His eventual conviction can therefore be seen not only as a legal victory, but as the product of a shifting alignment among different layers of authority in Chicago. The communities where he had exerted the most influence also changed across the decades. The West Side neighborhoods that once housed dense Italian enclaves saw significant demographic turnover, particularly in the post-war years. African American and later Latino residents moved into many of the blocks where his reputation had first been forged. Some of the old social clubs and taverns disappeared, replaced by different kinds of businesses. Yet the underlying vulnerabilities that had made those areas fertile ground for loan sharking, limited access to fair credit, precarious employment, distrust of official institutions, persisted in new forms. In that sense, Battaglia's story continues to resonate beyond the details of his life. It illustrates how structural conditions can sustain patterns of exploitation even as the cast of characters changes. Today, predatory payday lenders, unregulated online loan operations, and other high-interest credit schemes occupy some of the same functional space once held by outfit-backed juice loan operations. The faces and methods differ. The basic dynamic of desperation and unequal bargaining power remains. Understanding how someone like Battaglia operated, how he leveraged fear, reputation, and a lack of alternatives, helps illuminate the broader challenge of protecting vulnerable borrowers in any era. The records he left behind, though never intended as autobiography, offer glimpses of this dynamic from multiple angles. FBI surveillance reports describe him meeting with bookmakers and subordinates, moving deliberately, rarely speaking more than necessary. Court transcripts capture the voices of those on the receiving end of his organization's demands. Prison files sketch the end of the story. Blood pressure readings, notes on medications, clipped references to transfers between institutions as his health worsened. Taken together, these fragments form a mosaic that resists the temptation to reduce him either to a one-dimensional villain or to a victim of circumstance. He was, instead, a willing architect and beneficiary of a system that both reflected and deepened the inequalities of his city. To walk today through the streets where he once held sway is to find little visible trace of his presence. New buildings stand where old taverns and social clubs used to be. Expressways and redevelopment projects have carved through blocks that once formed the tight grid of his youth. Generations have grown up with different concerns, different dangers. Yet in the background hum of any big city, in the quiet calculations of people who must decide how to cover a rent shortfall, a medical bill, or a broken car when conventional credit is unavailable, the shadow of the world he inhabited lingers. In the archival silence that now surrounds his name, there is an irony. Men like Samuel Battaglia thrived on being talked about in certain circles and unmentioned in others. Their power depended on a whispered reputation among neighbors and on official euphemisms in police reports. In death, the balance has shifted. His reputation survives mainly in the formal language of case law, criminological studies, and declassified memoranda. The fear he once evoked in individual borrowers has receded. What remains is a cautionary record of how easily economic vulnerability can be turned into a weapon by those willing to operate outside the law. Seen through that lens, the story of his life and downfall is not simply an episode in the history of the Chicago outfit. It is a case study in the intersection of urban poverty, informal power, and the slow, often halting evolution of legal responses. It shows how a boy from a marginalized community, lacking access to legitimate paths of advancement, can become a central figure in a criminal empire, and how, over time, that same empire can be challenged when law, politics, and public sentiment finally align against it. On a clear day, standing on the near west side of Chicago, there is little to suggest that this ground once lay at the center of Samuel Battaglia's world. Expressways drone where tight rows of brick flats once stood. The University of Illinois at Chicago campus spreads across what used to be a dense patchwork of Italian, Jewish, and other immigrant streets. Old social clubs, corner groceries, and taverns have given way to parking lots, modern apartment blocks, and institutional buildings. The geography has shifted, yet the questions raised by his life still hang in the air. How power worked in these neighborhoods, who controlled access to money and protection, who benefited, and who paid the price. To retrace Battaglia's story here is to walk a city layered with memory. In old maps and city directories, the addresses that appear again and again in FBI files come into focus. Storefronts registered as restaurants or clubs, back rooms where bookmakers tallied wagers and collectors counted cash. These were the places where men like Battaglia did business, not in the sense of a conventional entrepreneur, but as part of a parallel economy. They were semi-public spaces. Anyone could walk in and buy a drink, but they also operated as nodes in a network of information and influence, where debts were extended, reputations were weighed, and decisions made about who would be pressured and how hard. The documentary record that allows us to reconstruct this world is uneven. Law enforcement materials provide one perspective, rich in detail where criminal investigations demanded it, but largely silent on the inner lives of those being watched. Court transcripts bring in the voices of some who crossed paths with Battaglia's operations, yet only those willing, or compelled, to speak under oath. Newspaper accounts, particularly from the 1960s, add snippets of description: his bearing in court, the color of his suit, the clipped responses of his attorneys. But much remains in shadow. We know little about his private conversations, his thoughts on the changing city, or any personal misgivings he might have harbored as the consequences of his choices bore down on him in prison. This asymmetry of documentation is itself part of the story. Organized crime, by design, leaves as few written traces as possible. Its leaders cultivate silence, favor face-to-face conversations, and avoid paper trails. They thrive on rumor and reputation rather than official records. The files that do exist were created by those who opposed them: police, prosecutors, regulatory agencies. As a result, what we know about a man like Samuel Battaglia is filtered through the eyes of his adversaries and, in some cases, his victims. That filter, while necessary for legal accountability, can also flatten complexity. Yet even through that lens, certain patterns emerge clearly. The first is the sheer persistence of his presence over time. From the 1920s, when he appeared in juvenile and early adult arrest reports as a 42 gang member, through the 1960s, when he stood in a federal courtroom as a convicted conspirator in extortionate credit schemes, Battaglia remained a constant in the landscape of Chicago's underworld. This continuity matters. It undermines the comforting notion that organized crime in America was a series of brief flare-ups around colorful personalities like Capone that faded quickly. In reality, as Battaglia's career illustrates, it was a long-term, adaptive system in which individuals could spend an entire working life, and more deeply embedded. A second pattern is the way his work blurred the boundaries between the legal and illegal economies. The people who borrowed from outfit lenders did so because they moved in the same markets as everyone else. They ran restaurants, small factories, trucking companies, repair shops. Their need for capital came from ordinary business pressures, an expansion opportunity, a shortfall in payroll, an equipment breakdown. When the banks would not help, they turned to sources that promised fast cash with few questions asked. The money was real. So were the contracts, however informal. What made the arrangement criminal was not the loan itself but the coercive apparatus around it. The threats, the inflated interest, the non-negotiable consequences of falling behind. Battaglia's position at the interface between those worlds gave him power out of all proportion to his formal status. He did not hold public office, did not control a police district or a bank. But in the neighborhoods where his name carried weight, he could effectively determine who had access to credit and on what terms. That kind of gatekeeping had ripple effects. Businesses that accepted his terms were locked into a relationship with the outfit, obligated not just to repay, but often to tolerate or facilitate other illicit activities. Those who refused might find themselves without options when hard times came. Over years, such patterns shaped the economic landscape of whole districts, redirecting flows of money and influence away from institutions accountable to the public and toward networks accountable only to themselves. For the broader Italian-American community of Chicago, figures like Battaglia presented a vexing contradiction. The vast majority of Italian immigrants and their descendants worked hard in lawful trades, built families, and navigated the same obstacles of prejudice and limited opportunity that he had once faced. Many despised the outfit's presence, resenting the way a small cadre of criminals reinforced negative stereotypes and made it easier for outsiders to view entire neighborhoods through the lens of suspicion. Italian-American civic organizations and anti-defamation groups, particularly from the 1950s onward, spoke out against what they saw as an unfair conflation of their heritage with organized crime. At the same time, there were residents who, out of fear, habit, or genuine belief in the usefulness of an unofficial authority structure, maintained ties with outfit figures. Some appreciated the predictability that came when a powerful local man could, at least in theory, impose a rough order on the streets. Others saw them as men who had made it, in a world that often seemed rigged against their community, even if the methods used violated the law. These attitudes did not reflect moral approval so much as the complicated calculus of survival in environments where formal institutions had repeatedly failed or marginalized them. In that context, Battaglia's story becomes a study in how informal power can be rationalized, tolerated, and even, in subtle ways, supported by parts of the community it harms. His ability to function for decades depended not only on fear, but on a web of accommodations. The tavern owner who looked the other way when collectors met in a back room, the patron who shrugged off knowledge of juice loans as just how things worked, the precinct worker who prioritized party loyalty over bringing troubling information to light. Each individual decision may have seemed minor. Collectively, they sustained a system that was extremely hard to dislodge. Law enforcement's eventual success in prosecuting him was possible only when a different web of relationships formed, one that aligned federal will, local cooperation, and changing public attitudes. Victims who once felt they had nowhere to turn were given protection and a measure of validation. Federal statutes, interpreted in light of evolving case law, gave prosecutors leverage they had previously lacked. Judges, informed by national discourse on organized crime, proved more willing to accept arguments about patterns and enterprises, rather than insisting on narrowly circumscribed views of offending. Battaglia's conviction, viewed from this angle, represents less the heroic triumph of a single agency than the slow realignment of multiple institutions toward a more coherent response. His legacy inside the world of law enforcement and criminology reflects this. Training materials for FBI agents and organized crime units in later decades pointed to the Chicago loan sharking cases as models of how to build complex prosecutions. The careful cultivation of informants, the assembly of corroborating financial evidence, the use of interstate commerce statutes to bring local rackets within federal reach. Lectures at police academies and conferences referenced men like Battaglia when explaining the importance of seeing beyond visible violence to the underlying economic structures that sustain criminal organizations. In popular culture, however, his presence is far more muted. Unlike Capone, Giancana, or later mob figures from New York and New Jersey, Battaglia has rarely been dramatized by name in films or television series. Elements of his story, especially the role of a physically imposing, feared collector enforcing high-interest debts, have been folded into composite characters in fictional narratives, but the man himself has remained largely in the background. This relative invisibility reflects both his own preference, during life, for avoiding the spotlight, and the fact that the kind of harm he specialized in does not lend itself easily to the kind of sensational storytelling that often drives entertainment. That absence from popular mythmaking is, in its own way, revealing. It reminds us that many of the most consequential figures in the history of organized crime were not the ones who sought publicity or whose names dominated headlines. They were the steady operators, the men who kept money flowing, disputes managed, and fear in circulation without drawing cameras. Battaglia epitomized that type. He was, as one law enforcement summary put it, a man whose strength lies not in flamboyance but in the quiet acceptance of his authority by those who know his reputation. From the perspective of the people who suffered under his organization's practices, that quiet acceptance could be the most oppressive thing of all. Knowing that a man like him stood behind your creditor, even if you never saw him personally, changed how you weighed every financial decision. When to pay, whom to trust, whether to seek help from authorities, all of these calculations were distorted by the awareness that failure might bring consequences beyond a simple late fee or a stern letter. It is that psychological dimension of his influence, its ability to shape behavior without constant direct intervention, that underscores how deeply embedded organized crime had become in certain corners of mid-century Chicago life. Today, discussions of organized crime in America often center on different groups and activities: transnational drug cartels, cybercrime syndicates, complex financial frauds. The Chicago outfit still exists in diminished form, but its heyday, The era in which men like Battaglia could walk local streets as near unquestioned authorities has passed. The legal environment is harsher. Communities are, in some places, more organized around resisting exploitation. Digital records make certain kinds of secrecy harder to maintain. Yet the core lesson of his story remains relevant. Where economic vulnerability meets limited access to fair, regulated credit, there will always be those willing to step into the gap, offering help on terms that can quickly turn predatory. In lectures and documentaries that look back on his life now, historians often end not with the details of his death in a Texas federal medical facility, but with the unresolved questions his trajectory leaves behind. How might his life have unfolded had he been born into a city with more equitable access to education and capital, in a neighborhood less stigmatized and structurally excluded? How many of the borrowers who later testified against him might have avoided his orbit entirely if they had been able to walk into a bank and receive a modest, fairly priced loan in their own name? These are counterfactuals, of course, unknowable paths not taken, but they highlight the extent to which individual criminal careers intersect with broader social policy. Samuel Battaglia was more than a product of his environment. He made deliberate, sustained choices to align himself with the most exploitative aspects of that environment, and he profited from them for decades. But his ability to do so on the scale he achieved depended on conditions that went far beyond one man's will. That recognition does not lessen his responsibility. It does, however, shift our focus from seeing his story solely as a morality tale about personal vice and punishment, toward understanding it as a window into how a modern city struggled, and at times failed, to build systems of justice and opportunity that were strong enough to displace those offered by its underworld. On the west side, where expressways now cut through former tenement blocks and new communities have woven their own stories into the city's fabric, the name Tietz seldom comes up. The living memory of his presence has faded. Yet in the archives, in the jurisprudence around extortion and racketeering, and in the ongoing efforts to protect vulnerable borrowers from new incarnations of old schemes, the shadow of his career remains. It stands as a reminder that the lines between legitimate need and criminal opportunity are often drawn in the spaces where official institutions are weakest, and that those who step in to fill those spaces, as Samuel Battaglia once did, can shape the life of a city for generations. In the end, what remains of Samuel Battaglia is not a grave that draws visitors or a household name, but a trail of documents and the lingering effects of the systems he helped build. His life is preserved in arrest sheets and surveillance logs, in the dry prose of appellate opinions, and the anxious testimony of borrowers who once sat across from outfit collectors in back rooms on Chicago's West Side. When historians or journalists try to assemble his story today, they do so by moving between those fragments, filling in context from broader studies of the city and its underworld. One of the striking things that emerges from this reconstruction is how closely his personal arc tracks the evolution of organized crime in 20th century Chicago. Born in 1908 into a poor Italian immigrant family, he came of age just as Prohibition transformed street gangs into major criminal enterprises. In his youth, he belonged to the 42 Gang, a notorious crew that supplied the next generation of leaders and enforcers to what came to be known as the Chicago Outfit. As he matured, so did the organization, from open bootlegging and headline-grabbing shootouts to quieter forms of control centered on gambling, labor racketeering, and in his case above all, loan sharking. By the 1950s and early 1960s, law enforcement summaries routinely described Battaglia as one of the outfit's most important figures. Some later researchers, looking back through those reports and correlating them with internal outfit changes, have concluded that for a time in the mid-1960s, he effectively served as the organization's front-line boss, managing day-to-day operations while older leaders like Tony Accardo remained behind the scenes. Whether or not one accepts that precise characterization, there is broad agreement that he stood near the top of the outfit hierarchy when federal authorities finally moved decisively against him. His conviction became part of a larger wave. Across the country in the 1960s, Justice Department initiatives, first under Robert Kennedy and then under his successors, produced a growing list of successful cases against entrenched criminal organizations. In Chicago, prosecutors targeted not only high-profile figures linked to headline scandals, but also those whose influence was exercised through less visible but deeply damaging practices such as predatory lending. Battaglia's prosecution under the Hobbs Act for extortion related to unlawful debt signaled that these quieter forms of coercion would no longer be treated as peripheral or purely local concerns. Retired agents and prosecutors, interviewed years later, often pointed to his case as a turning point in their understanding of how to tackle organized crime. The investigation had shown that it was possible to persuade frightened borrowers to come forward if they were offered protection, and if the broader public climate encouraged them to see themselves not as accomplices but as victims. It had demonstrated the value of patient work, compiling financial records, corroborating stories from multiple witnesses, and resisting the temptation to rely solely on spectacular incidents. And it underscored the importance of federal involvement in cities where local institutions were, for a variety of reasons, ill-equipped to confront powerful underworld figures on their own. At the same time, Battaglia's story highlights the limits of a purely law enforcement response. His loan sharking operations thrived because there was a demand for credit among people who had difficulty obtaining it through regulated channels. Shutting down one set of lenders did not eliminate that demand. In the years after his conviction, policymakers at the federal and state levels moved to regulate consumer credit more robustly, to cap interest rates, and to encourage the growth of community-based financial institutions such as credit unions. Advocates for economic justice argued that such reforms were as crucial to preventing future exploitation as any number of indictments. In Chicago, community organizations in the 1970s and 1980s began to confront financial discrimination directly, pushing banks to meet obligations under laws like the Community Reinvestment Act, and working to expand fair access to mortgages and business loans in neighborhoods that had long been redlined. Their efforts were not responses to Battaglia personally, but they addressed some of the same structural gaps his organization had exploited. To the extent that they succeeded, they helped reduce the space in which successors to his rackets could operate. The city's Italian-American community also continued to grapple with the legacy of men like him. Leaders of cultural and civic groups emphasized that the vast majority of Italian immigrants and their descendants had nothing to do with the outfit, and in many cases, suffered from its presence through higher insurance costs, damaged neighborhood reputations, and the corrosive effects of fear. They encouraged historical narratives that acknowledged the reality of organized crime without allowing it to define an entire group. In that effort, Battaglia appears not as a representative figure of a culture, but as one individual who chose and was enabled to pursue a particular path within a much larger, more diverse community. For law enforcement training programs, his case continues to serve as a practical example. Seminars on organized crime often walk new investigators through the stages of the Battaglia investigation. The early intelligence reports noting his role as an enforcer, the development of informants within gambling and loan sharking circles, the use of the Hobbs Act to frame local extortion as a federal matter, and the handling of witnesses whose fear and sense of shame initially made them reluctant to testify. By studying where earlier attempts to prosecute figures like him had failed, trainees learn how and why this later effort succeeded. Academics, for their part, tend to treat his life as a lens on broader patterns. Criminologists interested in the criminal career concept, how individuals move into, through, and out of sustained offending, have cited cases like his to illustrate how early immersion in delinquent peer groups, combined with structural barriers in legitimate labor markets, can lead to long, stable participation in organized crime. Urban historians use his trajectory to illuminate the social history of Chicago's ethnic neighborhoods, the pressures they faced, the informal institutions they developed, and the ways in which those institutions were sometimes captured or overshadowed by criminal elements. Viewed across this range of perspectives, Battaglia appears neither as an outsized legend nor as a footnote. He is, instead, a representative but particularly well-documented example of a type. The long-serving, economically focused organized crime leader whose influence extended over decades, who rarely sought public attention, and whose eventual downfall required sustained, coordinated effort. His nickname may stand out, but his role within the outfit, bridging street enforcement and higher-level financial control, was one filled, in different times and places, by many such figures. In the neighborhoods where he once operated, the direct memory of his presence has faded. By the time of his death in a federal prison hospital in 1973, demographic and physical changes had already transformed much of the West Side landscape. Urban renewal projects had cleared whole blocks. New immigrant groups and migrants from other parts of the United States had moved in. Over the ensuing decades, additional waves of change, deindustrialization, the crack epidemic, gentrification, reshaped the city again. Each wave brought its own forms of illicit enterprise and its own conflicts with law enforcement, often involving actors and organizations very different from the Italian-dominated outfit of Battaglia's era. Yet some continuities remain. The basic vulnerabilities that allowed his loan sharking operations to flourish, the gap between financial need and access to fair credit, the sense among some residents that official institutions are distant or indifferent, the willingness of a few to use fear and coercion for profit, are still present in Chicago and elsewhere. They manifest today in different guises, from predatory lending practices that operate within the law's margins, to entirely new forms of organized economic crime made possible by digital technology. When policymakers and advocates look for historical analogs to understand these challenges, they often return to mid-century cases like Battaglia's as cautionary examples. In that light, his life story acquires a dual character. On the one hand, it is a specific narrative about a particular man, rooted in the concrete details of Chicago's history. The 42 gang, the outfit, West Side taverns and loan offices, the federal courthouse, the prison. On the other hand, it functions as a parable about what can happen when legal and economic systems leave large numbers of people with few legitimate options, and when those who are willing to operate outside the law are permitted, through fear and accommodation, to fill the void. The documentary trail he left behind has one final implication. It shows that exposure and accountability, while often slow and partial, are possible. For decades, Samuel Battaglia moved in spaces where it seemed unlikely that any formal record could capture the full extent of his influence. Yet over time, pieces accumulated. A police officer's notation about a meeting, an agent's memo after a surveillance operation, a borrower's hesitant statement taken in a cramped interview room. Woven together, those pieces eventually formed a picture clear enough to convince a jury and to stand up on appeal. The story of his rise and fall, therefore, ends not with a revelation or a confession, but with the quiet work of institutions finally doing what they had long struggled to do: recognize the nature of the threat he represented, protect those harmed by his organization, and impose legal consequences that reached beyond the street-level offenders to the men directing them. His death in custody closed his personal file. The issues his life raises, the interplay of crime, poverty, discrimination, political accommodation, and law, remain open. Standing again on those West Side streets, now changed almost beyond recognition, it is possible to see his story as part of a longer, ongoing struggle over who controls the terms of everyday life in a great city. In one period, men like Samuel Battaglia wielded that control through a mixture of economic leverage and implied violence. In response, others, police, prosecutors, community organizers, lawmakers, ordinary citizens, worked, often imperfectly and belatedly, to reclaim that ground for accountable institutions. The balance between those forces has never been static. But by tracing the contours of Battaglia's life, from his beginnings in an immigrant tenement to his end in a federal prison, we gain a clearer view of how that struggle has unfolded, and of the choices, collective as well as individual, that will shape how it unfolds in the future.